majority and minority subcommittee staff for all of their hard work and to acknowledge the efforts of my own personal staff. Mr. Speaker, within the strict budgetary limitations that were given the committee and this section, an improved version, I am in favor of the bill, and I would ask my colleagues to vote for it.
Gentleman from Kentucky.
I yield 3 minutes, Mr. Speaker, to the distinguished chairman of the State Foreign Ops chair of the subcommittee, the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Granger.
Gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of the State Foreign Operations Division of this conference agreement, which contains $42.1 billion in discretionary budget authority. This means that since January, spending in this bill will decrease by $6.6 billion, or more than 13%. The agreement includes overseas contingency operations spending for state and USAID to implement in frontline states in conflict areas. These costs are temporary and extraordinary and will be reduced over time. This bill has been written to address our foreign assistance and State Department funding through the lens of what is most important to our national security interests and the security of our allies and our neighbor, Mexico. The bill provides security assistance for critical allies, including full funding for the U.S.-Israel Memorandum of Understanding. The bill also carries new language on the Palestinian Authority, cutting off their economic aid and stopping their ability to have a U.S. office if they obtain state status at the United Nations. Additionally, the bill addresses concerns about assistance to Egypt and to Pakistan. New restrictions are also placed on the UN and other international organizations. For example, funds are withheld from these organizations until they publicly display their audits and financial reports. I want to thank the members of the State Foreign Operations Appropriations Subcommittee, and in particular my ranking member, Mrs. Lowy, who has been extremely helpful in developing this compromise. I also thank my colleagues across the Capitol who worked in good faith for the best possible outcomes. I believe that we were successful in protecting our national security while providing appropriate oversight of taxpayer dollars. I want to sincerely thank the staff, from Mrs. Lowy's staff, Steve Marcase, Aaron Kolodziejski, and Talia Dubovi, and on my staff, Anne-Marie Chotbach, Celia Alvarado, Alice Hogans, Susan Adams, Craig Higgins, Jamie Gwynn, Johnny Caberly, and Matt Leffingwell. They all worked at appreciable hours and with great dedication. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield the floor.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Washington.
I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlewoman from New York, the ranking member of the State Foreign Operations Subcommittee, Ms. Lowy.
Gentlelady from New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
As ranking member of the State Foreign Operations Subcommittee, I want to congratulate Chairwoman Granger, Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Dix, and the outstanding majority and minority staff. Thank you all for working together with me on a bill that will help maintain our global leadership, protect national security, and promote economic growth. Our wise investments in better health and education systems, economic opportunity in the developing world, humanitarian assistance, international financial institutions, development assistance, economic support funds, and international family planning will help to save lives, develop the next generation of U.S. trading partners, to boost job growth domestically, and confront the conditions that foster radicalism and instability that threaten the long-term security of the United States. This bill also fully funds our agreements with vital allies, including Israel, Jordan, and Egypt, and supports governance and development activities in Egypt to aid the transition to democracy. However, we do not write blank checks, and stringent conditions on continued assistance for Egypt, the Palestinian Authority, Pakistan, and Afghanistan will help ensure accountability and responsible use of taxpayer dollars. This bill is aimed at advancing our economic and strategic interests around the world through effective and efficient diplomacy and development, and I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington rise?
I rise to just go out of order here for 1 second to yield
For as much
2
time
minutes
as you
to
can
the
consume?
gentleman, 2 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, the Democratic whip, Mr. Hoyer, my good friend and a former member of the Appropriations Committee, who's worked very strongly with us all year to move these bills forward.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized
I
for 2
thank the
minutes.
gentleman for his comments. I thank him for yielding, and I rise in support of this legislation. But this ought to be a lesson for us in some humility. I was the majority leader. Had I, as majority leader, brought that bill that sits on that floor, 1,207 pages, within the last 24 hours to the floor, I think the response from that side of the aisle would have been harsh, accusatory, and not helpful. Now, how do I say that? Why do I say that? Because it happened. And it ought to be a portion of humility for all of us to understand that the legislative process is difficult. We bring different views. We represent different constituencies. We have different priorities. I rise in strong support of this bill, and I urge my colleagues to support this piece of legislation. None of them have read it. Not one of us has read every page in this bill. I see the chairman raising his hand, and I take him at his word. That means 434 of us will have to rely on his advice and counsel. And I'm sure Mr. Dix has read it as well. My point is not that we work by committees, as President Wilson said, and we've worked hard on this bill through the year. My Republican colleagues during the course of the last election said we're going to bring bills one at a time to the floor and consider them. The labor health bill that is included in a substantial portion of those pages not only has not been brought to the floor, it didn't pass the subcommittee, nor the full committee, nor this floor. But this bill has been worked on carefully. And I want to congratulate Mr. Rogers and Mr. Dix and all of the subcommittee chairs for working out the differences that we had so we could do what the American people expect us to do. Come to agreement on a bill that none of us perceives as perfect, but perceive as a positive step for our country. And
Gentleman's yielded an additional minute.
And I therefore urge all my colleagues to support this bill. Yes, it will keep government open, which is essential. But it will also do the most fundamental job that this Congress has to do every year, and that is to fund appropriately the priorities that this Congress puts before the country. So again, in closing, Mr. Speaker, let me congratulate my friend Hal Rogers from Kentucky, with whom I served on the Appropriations Subcommittee for over 2 decades, and Mr. Dix, with whom I've served every day of my congressional career. Both are decent, hard-working, conscientious representatives. They and their subcommittee chairs and ranking members have come together to present this product. It is time to act. It is time to act positively, and I will, when the roll is called, be supporting this piece of legislation. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky.
I thank the gentleman for those comments. I yield now, Mr. Speaker, 3 minutes to the chairman of the Interior Subcommittee, gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Simpson.
Who?
Thank you, Mr.
Oh,
Chairman.
Mr. Simpson is recognized for 3 seconds.
Was that 3 seconds or 3 minutes, Mr.
Apparently it was
Chairman?
3 minutes. The gentleman from Idaho is recognized for 3
Thank
minutes,
you.
maybe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me thank Chairman Rogers and Ranking Member Dix. As I've told many members, if this is your first term or your second term or your third term here in this body, this is actually the first time you've actually seen an appropriation bill come to the floor under an open rule. And I know that's something we both want. I know it's very the majority party wants that, and I know the minority party wants that also. And while Mr. Hoyer was correct, we didn't get them all done. We are moving in the right direction, and we will get there, where every bill comes under an open rule so that members have input into that legislation, and that's what we're working toward, and I want to thank you for that. But first, let me also thank my partner in this effort, Mr. Moran from Virginia. He's been a great asset in working out this bill. We don't always agree on every issue. I'm from Idaho, he's from Virginia. And so we sometimes have differences of opinion, but we're able to sit down and work together to solve those differences and work out a bill that I think is in the best interest of the American public. The Interior Bill Conference Agreement is $29.175 billion, which is $384 million below the FY enacted level. The conference agreement funds the EPA at $8.45 billion, which is $233 million below the FY11 enacted level, and $524 million below the President's request. The bill also includes in Title IV a general provision that amends the Clean Air Act to transfer air quality permitting authority as of the date of this enactment from the Environmental Protection Agency to the Department of Interior. This will provide regulatory parity for the Beaufort and Chukchi Sea planning areas with the Western and Central Gulf of Mexico planning areas. It fully funds the newly created Bureau of Ocean Energy Management with $60 million to help expedite the review of offshore exploration plans. It also fully funds the newly created Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement at $76 million, including $15 million for oil spill research. It provides authority for the collection of $62 million in inspection fees, but it dedicates funding for approving permits, expediting exploration plans, and hiring much-needed inspectors and engineers, while also accelerating the approval of drilling plans. It fully funds wildfire suppression at the 10-year average. It cuts the NEA and NEH funding by $17.4 million combined in this bill from the 2011 appropriation. It provides $4.3 billion to the Indian Health Service. This has been a bipartisan effort with Mr. Dix when he was chairman of this committee, with Mr. Moran when he was chairman of this committee, and now with me, that we fully fund the Indian Health Services. This is a 5.8% increase in this bill to address the health care needs in Indian country, including access to Indian health facilities and contractual obligations to tribes. It provides $108 million for the Smithsonian, including $75 million for the construction of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. It does several things for Westerners that live in public land states relative to grazing. There's a new provision that requires that the administrative review process first be exhausted before litigating on grazing issues. It provides protection for trailing of livestock. This overall is a good bill, and I think it's one that we can all be proud of. And again, I want to thank Mr. Moran for his dedication and work on this. But most of all, I want to thank the staff on both sides of the aisle who worked. If you're not on this committee, if you don't work with this committee, you don't know how much time they put in. And they do an incredible job for Congress, for the American people. And I thank you and yield back.
Gentleman from Washington.
I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Virginia, the ranking member of the Interior Subcommittee, Mr. Moran.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I too want to join the chorus in commending Chairman Rogers and Chairman Simpson and our ranking member Norm Dix and the phenomenal work of the appropriations staff on both sides. Rick Healy and Shalonda Young, for example, have been working on this bill for the last several months, sometimes through the night. But all the pros on approach staff, they led by Dave Pomerantz, as Deputy Leslie Turner, Bill Ingley, they are pros, and they all deserve special recognition. Mr. Speaker, this is a vast improvement over the Interior and Environment bill considered by the House in July. The agreement provides $1.7 billion more than the initial House allocation. $8.4 billion is provided for EPA. It's $1.3 over the House bill. The agreement maintains basically level funding for the operation of the National Park Service, and it restores funding for the science programs in USGS. Land and Water Conservation Fund programs are increased by $22 million over last year's level. And it's important to note that we've restored funding for endangered species and critical habitat listings. Subcommittee Chairman Mike Simpson spearheaded a bipartisan effort in support of funding for Native American programs. And as a result, the Indian Health Service is increased by 6%, important increases in education, public safety, tribal government. This agreement doesn't abandon our commitment to the arts. In fact, NEA and NEH are each given $11 million over the House allocation. It's equal to the President's request.
Just as important, though, as what is included in this agreement is what is not. The conferees dropped more than 24 unacceptable environmental riders that were a part of the House bill. Gone are the greenhouse gas, the Grand Canyon uranium mining, the mountaintop mining removal riders, to name just a few. Now, this is not to say that the bill is completely devoid of any environmental restrictions, but this is a compromise. And I can say that in nearly every instance, what has been included is significantly improved over what was originally proposed. Can I have an extra 10 seconds here?
I yield the gentleman 15 additional seconds.
So recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I want to say this. This is the way things were meant to be done in this body. Politics was meant to be the art of compromise, with people acting in good faith for the betterment of their country. That's what this omnibus appropriations bill is all about. And so it deserves to be passed unanimously. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the chairman of the Legislative Branch Subcommittee on Appropriation. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Crenshaw.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Well, I thank the chairman for yielding the time, and I thank him for his leadership. I urge all my colleagues to support this conference report because I think it takes another step to change this culture of spending that we've had in this town to a culture of savings, and we actually spend less money this year than we spent last year. And when you look at the Legislative Branch Subcommittee, which I chair, you'll find that we reduced spending this year by 7.5%. In fact, the money that we spend on the legislative branch is less than we spent last year. It's less than we spent in 2010, and it's less money than we spent in 2009. And when you look specifically at the House of Representatives, which we are all a part of, the last 2 cycles we have reduced spending on the House of Representatives by over 10%. When we ask other agencies of the federal government to do more with less, to rein in spending, to tighten their belt, be more effective, be more efficient, we have not exempted ourselves from that, and we have led by example. Every member's office account in this body has been reduced by 10% these last 2 years. The leadership offices have had their funding reduced by 10%. And the committees as well. Even the Appropriations Committee has been reduced by even more than 10%. So I think this is another step forward to fund our priorities but exercise spending discipline. And I certainly want to thank my ranking member, Mr. Honda, for his cooperation and hard work. Thank all our staff members for their dedication and commitment, and urge my colleagues to support this very good bill. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Washington.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, the ranking member of the Legislative Branch Subcommittee, Mr. Honda.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, today Congress is considering a bill to keep the government running for the remainder of the fiscal year. That is our basic responsibility of members of Congress. I am pleased that we are operating under regular order and considering the conference report. The American people want us to work together. This package is a reflection of what we can accomplish through hard work and compromise. The legislative branch appropriation bill will provide the Congress and its agencies with $4.3 billion to work with, which is a reduction from the previous fiscal year. I have hope for more funds for the Congressional Budget Office and the Government Accountability Office, who have experienced increased demands from members during these budget-focused times. However, I am glad we restored funding for agencies that were the targets of the most extreme cuts proposed in the original House bill. This conference report restores $18 million to the Government Printing Office, $12 million to the Library of Congress, averting layoffs the original House bill would have caused. Capitol Police funding remains at last year's level of $340.1 million. It is the only legislative branch agency that was not cut from last year's level. This conference report includes language requiring the Chief Administrative Officer and the Sergeant-at-Arms to take on more of a leadership role in setting policies regarding district office security, including helping members renegotiate leases to secure more favorable terms on security requirements. This bill provides the basic level of funding for the ledge branch of the government and should be sufficient to keep current services in place. That is why I support this bill and ask my colleagues to do the same. I want to thank Chairman Crenshaw and his staff for the collegial working relationship throughout this process. Liz Dawson, the majority clerk, Chuck Turner and Jenny Kasaya from the subcommittee, and Michael Curlin from his personal staff. I also want to thank my staff, Shalonda Young, the minority clerk, and Mark Nakamoto from my personal staff. Mr. Speaker, while not perfect, this bill is the result of a lot of hard work and compromise. I thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle and yield back.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, can you tell us what the time is on both sides?
Gentleman from Washington has 9 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Kentucky controls 3.5 minutes. Gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Oklahoma, a very hard-working member of the Appropriations Committee, Mr. Cole.
Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, first of all, I'd like to congratulate Chairman Rogers and Ranking Member Dix for an exceptionally hard job, which yielded, frankly, a very good product. This bill spends less, $70 billion less than the President requested, $6 billion less than we spent last year. The second year in a row we've actually cut discretionary spending. The bill cuts by 5% funding for EPA regulatory programs, which have passed some wildly unpopular and costly rules. The bill eliminates 23 programs totaling more than $240 million. And while this bill cuts wasteful spending, it actually focuses additional funds on things that count: defending our country, helping some of our most vulnerable and challenged citizens, and providing funds to educate some of our most disadvantaged young people. The bill provides a 1.6% pay increase for the military, as requested by the President, and funds the defense, health, and military family programs at $1.1 billion above FY 2011 and $283 million above the President's request. Along with supporting our armed forces, this bill exceeds the FY 2011 levels for our veterans. The $58 billion in discretionary spending this bill fully funds is $2.1 billion above last year's level for those who have served our country. In addition, the Indian Health Service is funded at $4.3 billion, an increase of nearly 6%. I particularly want to thank Chairman Simpson and Ranking Member Moran for their hard efforts. The original House bill was actually even higher. It's our friends in the Senate who actually reduced funding here. The House really did a great job in this area. Finally, I want to note TRIO funding was increased in a difficult environment by $15 million. Mr. Speaker, this is a good bill. It reprioritizes our spending away from wasteful programs that don't work toward things that are truly important for the American people. I urge its passage. I thank my friends for their hard work. Certainly yield to my friend.
I just want to commend the gentleman for his work on support of Indian country, both the Indian Health Service, the BIA. You have been a tireless advocate. Our subcommittee on Interior has had bipartisan work on this issue, and I commend you for your strong leadership on that important issue.
I thank the gentleman very much, and appreciate that. And with that, I yield back, urging the passage of the bill.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Washington.
Okay. I yield 3.5 minutes to the distinguished gentlewoman from Connecticut, the ranking member of the Labor Health and Human Services Appropriations Subcommittee, Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro.
Gentlelady from Connecticut is recognized for 3.5.
Thank you to my colleague, Congressman Dix, and to the chairman, Mr. Rogers, also to the staff, both majority and minority, for their tireless work in this effort, including David Pomerantz, Stephen Crane, David Reich, Lisa Molyneux, and Letty Medeiros. Susan Frost as well. They did unbelievable work in this effort. I rise in support of this budget for 2012. It funds the government at a level consistent with the Budget Control Act without many of the damaging and extraneous ideological riders that marked earlier efforts. Make no mistake, there are real cuts here, including hard cuts to vital programs like the LIHEAP program, the Low Income Energy Assistance Program. Still, I believe this legislation has been improved. In terms of labor, health, and human services and education, the agreement restores $2.9 billion in cuts made in the chairman's draft. These restorations are key investments in job creation, education, and the health and the well-being of families that will lead us to recovery. We know, especially as over 13 million of our fellow Americans look for work, that investments in human capital like job training and reemployment services are part of the core essential role for government. They help responsible people succeed, and I am pleased that this agreement restores the 74% cut to job training programs that was proposed in the original chairman's bill, which was never considered before the committee. Health care is no longer shortchanged. With an aging population and a nursing shortage before us, we need to make wise investments in our health workforce. The programs that help to train primary care doctors, nurses, and other health providers, cut by 61% in the majority's draft, are now only cut by 6%. Funding for vital mental health services, once cut by 17%, are now only cut by 3%. And this agreement retains key investments in the Affordable Care Act implementation and in Title X. I'm glad to see the National Institutes of Health receive a funding increase of $299 million, and a new National Center for Advancing Translational Science, as proposed by Director Francis Collins, is established. NIH can now keep funding life-saving research and pushing the frontiers of medical knowledge. Perhaps no other investments we make are as important as the ones we make in our children. This agreement includes a $60 million increase for the Child Care and Development Block Grant, providing desperately needed aid to working parents for safe and reliable child care. It provides a $424 million increase for Head Start, allowing our kids to continue a path to academic success. $60 million increase to Title I, supporting schools serving low-income children, and a $100 million increase to IDEA, supporting students with special needs. One of the hardest issues for this conference has been Pell Grants. The agreement maintains the maximum grant amount of $5,550. Too many students I have met, even a $100 cut would have derailed their prospects for higher education. At the same time, we have made some targeted cost-saving changes to the program that should eliminate the funding shortfall for this year and perhaps next year as well. I am pleased to see that the virtual elimination of the Corporation for National and Community Service, proposed in the majority's draft, has been rolled back. Instead of ending AmeriCorps, it will continue.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
I encourage my colleagues to support this conference agreement and would encourage all to do so. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from Washington.
I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Georgia, the ranking member of the Military Construction and Veterans Affairs Subcommittee, Mr. Bishop.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this conference agreement. The Milcon VA section of the conference agreement includes a discretionary total of $71.7 billion, a decrease of $1.4 billion below last year's level, and a decrease of $2.1 billion before the President's request. The military construction the conference agreement provides $13.1 billion for military construction projects, and reductions to the budget requests are possible because of savings on projects that were appropriated in previous years. However, even with these reductions, the agreement funds family housing construction at $1.7 billion, which provides for a total of 48 new family housing units, 80 replacement units, and improvements to 216 family housing units. For Veterans Affairs, the conference agreement provides a total of $122.2 billion for the FY12 programs for the Department of Veterans Affairs, of which $58.5 billion is discretionary funding. The agreement also contains $52.5 billion in advance funding for the VA, the identical level that was requested by the President for our VA medical accounts. Mr. Speaker, I'm also pleased that the conference agreement provides $45.8 million for Arlington National Cemetery, which is $700,000 over last year's level.
Finally, Mr. Speaker, the conference agreement fully funds the Armed Forces Retirement Home request and includes $14.6 million for the Armed Forces Retirement Home to facilitate the repairs at the D.C. campus to repair damage sustained by the earthquake in August. Mr. Speaker, let me just thank the committee and the subcommittee staff for all of their hard work in pulling the bill together on a bipartisan, bicameral, cooperative way, taking leadership from our chairman and our ranking member, who have worked tirelessly to get this appropriations process back to regular order. I urge the adoption of the conference report, and I urge all my colleagues to support it. It's a good bill.
Gentleman from Kentucky still reserves. Gentleman from Washington.
I yield 1.5 minutes to the distinguished gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Kaptur, who is the next ranking member on the Democratic side of the House Appropriations Committee.
Gentlelady from Ohio is recognized for a minute and a half.
I thank my dear friend and colleague Congressman Dix and Rock to support this conference report. This bill is welcome news and helps restore confidence that America can govern. It is essential to economic growth and job creation in our country, and the bill cuts overall discretionary spending by $7 billion over last year and also $98 billion less than the President's FY12 budget proposal. This bill demonstrates the Appropriations Committee is still one of the few that properly functions in this institution, and I can't thank enough Chairman Hal Rogers and Ranking Member Norm Dix for their bipartisan leadership and hard work along with their staff to bring this House to regular order. This legislation includes vital funding for the defense of our nation and our domestic imperatives. The bill includes support for our Great Lakes ports, as in Cleveland, Lorain, Sandusky, and Toledo, as well as around the country, invests in their infrastructure necessary to modernize those facilities to increase our exports and increase jobs. It also includes environmental restoration funding needed for the Great Lakes to allow economic revitalization as we create more maritime jobs and nature tourism. The bill keeps our commitment to establish America's energy independence with robust investments in renewable energy, in solar, wind, and biomass. The investments in technology for those represent not just jobs for today but for tomorrow. As we grow our economy forward, budget certainty matters for fiscal year 2012. I urge my colleagues to support this so that we can govern our nation in the nation's interest. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Kentucky yields. Gentleman from Washington.
Yes, I yield 1 minute to Congresswoman Barbara Lee from California, a distinguished member of the Appropriations Committee.
Gentlelady from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Let me thank the gentleman for yielding, and also let me thank the chairman and our ranking member and the subcommittee chairs really for bringing together a bipartisan bill to the floor. But I cannot support this bill because, once again, poor and low-income communities are taking the brunt of the terrible cuts. While there are good provisions in this bill, what we have, however, is a bill loaded with special interest Tea Party Republican riders at the expense of low-income people, especially women of color, right here in Washington, D.C. Cutting off low-income women of color in Washington, D.C. from access to the same health and reproductive services available throughout the country is really not critical to preventing a shutdown. Forcing the continuation of abstinence-only sex education that fails to meet the needs of young people, that's not critical to preventing a government shutdown. Increasing the spread of HIV and hepatitis C through dirty needles is not critical to preventing a government shutdown. Finally, let me just say, this bill continues to fund over $2 billion a week, mind you, $2 billion a week on a war without end in Afghanistan. We must allow the Afghan people to control their own destiny and immediately begin to pull our brave young men and women in uniform out of harm's way.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have remaining?
Both sides have 1 minute remaining.
Would the chairman yield me a minute
I'm sorry?
to do a colloquy?
I'll be happy to yield.
Yes.
Who is yielding what time here?
I yield to the gentlelady from Guam.
Gentleman from Washington yields a minute to the gentlelady from Guam.
I thank the gentleman very much.
Section 2207 of the recently passed FY12 Defense Authorization Bill restricts transfer of funding from the Department of Defense to support civilian infrastructure requirements on Guam, except funding specifically authorized in law. Does the language of Section 8110 of Division A of this bill require any further authorization?
I thank the gentlelady from Guam for raising this question. It is our intent that Section 8110 of Division A of this bill has the required authorization and should be executed by the Department of Defense as specified in Division A of this bill to support civilian infrastructure requirements on Guam.
I thank the gentleman for the clarification.
I yield back the balance of my time.
From Kentucky. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of our time. Urge an aye vote on the measure.
Gentleman yields back. Here we go. Pursuant to House Resolution 500, the previous question is ordered. The question is on the adoption of the conference report. Pursuant to Clause 10 of Rule 20, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings are postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 500, I call up H. Conres 94, directing the clerk of the House of Representatives to make corrections in the enrollment of H.R. 3672 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the concurrent resolution.
House Concurrent Resolution 94, concurrent resolution directing the clerk of the House of Representatives to make corrections in the enrollment of H.R. 3672.
Pursuant to House Resolution 500, the concurrent resolution is considered read. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Rogers, and the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Dix, each will control 10 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 2 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized.
And I rise to present H. Conres 94. This bill contains a legislative provision to offset the $8.1 billion in disaster funding provided by H.R. 3672, which we will consider shortly. This offset is funded by a 1.83% across-the-board cut to all of fiscal 2012 base discretionary spending except the Department of Defense, Military Construction, and Veterans Affairs. Such an offset ensures that we are living within our means while still providing for the hundreds of thousands of Americans affected by recent natural disasters with the help that they need. I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting this resolution, which in effect pays for the disaster funding which will come later, and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
It is the opinion of the, I yield myself as much time as I may.
The gentleman is recognized.
It is the opinion of our side that this is unnecessary, but we've got to move forward and get this bill passed. So I don't object to this particular provision. I hope we can move forward. And I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers. I'm prepared to yield back if the gentleman is.
I'm prepared to yield back. I yield back my time.
And I yield back my time, urging support.
Gentleman yields back. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 500, the previous question is ordered. The question is on the adoption of the concurrent resolution. Those in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The concurrent resolution is agreed to. Without objection.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having arisen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 500, I call up the bill H.R. 3672, a bill making appropriations for disaster relief requirements for the fiscal year ending September 30, 2012, and for other purposes, and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3672, a bill making appropriations for disaster relief requirements for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2012, and for other purposes.
Pursuant to House Resolution 500, the bill is considered read. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Rogers, and the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Dix, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to present H.R. 3672, the Disaster Relief Appropriations Act, which is the third bill in our final appropriations package for fiscal year 2012. This bill provides a total of $8.1 billion in funding for critical aid and recovery assistance for disaster emergencies. Of this total, $6.4 billion will go to FEMA's Disaster Relief Fund. This includes funding for fire assistance, emergency declarations, major disasters, surge operations, and disaster readiness support. In addition, these funds will help cover costs from large-scale previous disasters, such as the summer 2011 tornadoes and Hurricane Irene. We've had a historic chain of disasters in this country over the last year or so. The legislation also provides $1.7 billion in funding for disaster recovery assistance through the Army Corps of Engineers. This funding will help repair damage to critical infrastructure caused by recent storms and floods and will help prepare for future disaster events. This total adheres to the total disaster funding level agreed to under the Budget Control Act this past summer. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation to provide our communities and families with the support they need as they recover from these devastating natural disasters. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
I yield myself as much time as I may
Gentleman's recognized.
utilize. This year, natural disasters have had devastating impacts on the lives of many Americans. Today, we are considering a bill that provides relief to those severely damaged communities. In total, the bill provides $8.1 billion in vital funding to rebuild areas affected by numerous horrific disasters in 2011, as well as funding long-term rebuilding needs that date back as far as Hurricane Katrina. Of the $8.1 billion, $6.4 billion is for FEMA. This funding will meet the federal commitment to restore impacted areas after hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires, and severe snowstorms. Almost every state and territory will receive a portion of this funding. With the adoption of this bill, families and businesses will receive the funding they need for vital recovery and rebuilding efforts. The bill also provides $1.7 billion to repair damage to the Corps of Engineers facilities, roughly equal to the need identified by the Corps within presidentially declared disaster areas. In nearly every year since 1997, the Congress has recognized the need to provide funding to respond to natural disasters. This bill recognizes that responsibility. I urge strong support of this legislation and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the distinguished chairman of the Financial Services Subcommittee on Appropriations, gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Emerson.
Gentlelady from Missouri is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. 3 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker. I'm so relieved that this measure today will provide desperately needed funds for emergencies and disasters which occurred all over the country this past year. For most Americans, the thought of the suffering caused by tornadoes and floods fades with the newspaper headlines. Months later, though, so many in our country are still trying to recover from storms and events that took them from their homes, their livelihoods, their safety, or all of the above. This funding and a reminder of their plight are very important to call to mind as we vote upon this measure. I'd like to recognize these folks in southern Missouri who have been through it all and have set such a remarkable example and really come out fighting. We have Wendell Choate, who's over 80 years old, and his daughter Beth, who runs their sweet corn farm of several thousand acres. All of it was destroyed. Brother Bennett, who lived in the floodway for over 80 years, he lost his home. Milas and Wanda Wallace, they lost their home, and so much of their land was damaged by scouring. Linnell and Mary Robinson, along with the entire historic black community of Pinhook, including the Williams and the Strayhorns, Randy Sutton, Ellett Rafferty, the Story family, the Dugan family, Randy Sutton, Eddie Marshall, Lester Gooden, Carlin Bennett, our presiding commissioner, and Kevin Maynard, mayor of East Prairie and a farmer in the floodway. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
I yield 4 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Indiana, the ranking member of the Energy and Water Subcommittee, Mr. Visklosky.
The gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 4 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding and rise in strong support of the legislation. I would like to begin my remarks by indicating that I consider investing in our water infrastructure as a key component in disaster relief. That is, if we can avoid disasters in the first place, we prevent harm and we certainly save the taxpayers much money. Several years ago, perhaps if we had made an adequate investment in water infrastructure, we might not have avoided the issue of spending more money in one city in this country in 1 year, New Orleans, than we did on every water project in the United States of America combined. In the omnibus bill that we have just considered, we have increased funding for the Army Corps over the budget request and over last year's level. However, despite the best efforts of the subcommittee, we are still $443 million below that provided to the Corps in fiscal year 2010. At these levels, we are not close to addressing the Corps' backlog of navigation and flood control projects. That is why I am pleased today to rise in support of this bill that does provide $1.7 billion in Corps disaster relief funding. This has been an extraordinary flood season. Further, in August, Hurricane Irene caused significant damage. Assuming there are no additional natural disasters in 2012, this funding appears adequate to address damages within presidential declared disaster areas. However, my colleagues should be aware there are damages to the tune of $233 million, which must be addressed at locations outside declared disaster areas for which the bill does not provide funding. And again, we must note that there are no monies provided for emergencies that may occur between now and October 1st of 2012. We know that potentially wildfires, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, and earthquakes will occur. So I would simply conclude by saying that moving forward, and again I strongly support this bill, we must as an institution have the intestinal fortitude to budget for emergencies in anticipation of them on an annual basis, and I would yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky rise?
Mr. Speaker, I'm prepared to yield back if the gentleman is.
I have no further speakers, and I'm prepared to yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Washington yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time and urge an aye vote.
The gentleman from Kentucky yields back the balance of his time. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 500, the previous question is ordered on the bill. The question is on engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
A bill making appropriations for disaster relief requirements for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2012, and for other purposes.
The question is on passage of the bill. Pursuant to Clause 10 of Rule 20, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings are postponed. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, proceedings will resume on questions previously postponed. Votes will be taken in the following order. Adoption of the conference report to accompany H.R. 2055, adoption of the House Concurrent Resolution 9-4, and passage of H.R. 3672. The first electronic vote will be conducted as a 15-minute vote. Remaining electronic votes will be considered as 5-minute votes. The unfinished business is on the question of adoption of the conference report on H.R. 2055, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2055, an act making appropriations for military construction, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and related agencies for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2012, and for other purposes.
The question is on the adoption of the conference report. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote.
On this vote, the yeas are